The air in the monastic library was perpetually cool, thick with the scent of ancient parchment and the quiet industry of dust motes dancing in stray shafts of sunlight. It was a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where centuries breathed alongside the living. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose life had been a meticulous excavation of forgotten histories, found it both sanctuary and crypt. He was not searching for revelation, merely for a footnote, a minor textual variant in a rarely consulted Syriac manuscript, yet, as so often happens when one delves into the deep past, the past chose to reveal itself in an unexpected, unsettling way. His fingers, accustomed to the brittle fragility of ancient vellum, paused on a loose binding. The manuscript, a collection of ascetic sayings attributed to early desert fathers, seemed innocuous enough, but tucked within its decaying spine, almost as if deliberately concealed, was a single, folded sheet of papyrus. It was not part of the codex. It was far older, its texture finer, its script a faded, elegant Greek, unlike the cruder Syriac of the main volume. Aris unfolded it with practiced care. The fragment was small, perhaps a third of a complete page, but its content struck him cold. He had seen thousands of ancient texts, deciphered countless obscurities, but the words before him resonated with a chilling familiarity, yet twisted into a form he did not recognize. It spoke of a Nazarene, certainly, and of his teachings, but the voice was subtly different, the emphasis disturbingly distinct. Phrases that mirrored canonical verses were present, but they were surrounded by utterances that spoke not of external salvation, but of an intrinsic divine spark, of a kingdom found not in adherence to creed, but in the radical transformation of the inner self. He spent weeks, then months, poring over the fragment, cross-referencing lexicon after lexicon, comparing linguistic quirks to known texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries. The more he studied it, the more unsettling the implications became. This was not a minor apocryphal text, nor a mere devotional writing. The language, the theological concepts, the very rhythm of its discourse suggested a fully developed gospel narrative, one that presented a Christ profoundly at odds with the Christ of the emerging Roman Church. The academic world, when he cautiously presented his findings, was initially dismissive. Such claims were often met with skepticism, sometimes outright derision. "Another forgery," they murmured. Another well-meaning but deluded scholar seeing what he wishes to see, the prevailing scholarly consensus, carefully constructed over centuries, maintained that the canonical Gospels represented the earliest and most authentic records of Christ's teachings, and that any significant departures were later, secondary developments, or outright heresies. The very idea of a foundational gospel deliberately erased from history was, for many, an affront to the integrity of their discipline. Yet, Aris persisted. He uncovered faint, almost imperceptible allusions in the writings of early church fathers to a gospel they vehemently condemned, often without naming it directly, or referring to it in vague, derogatory terms like the gospel of perfection or the secret gospel. These were not casual dismissals, they were passionate, almost fearful denunciations. Why such vitriol against a text that, supposedly, had ceased to exist? His research led him to other isolated fragments, held in private collections or miscatalogued in obscure archives. A single page in a Coptic collection in Berlin, hinting at a dialogue between the Nazarene and a disciple about the illusory nature of the material world, a reference in an obscure patristic commentary to a gospel that taught followers to become gods. Piecing these subtle clues together, Aris began to form a terrifying hypothesis. There existed, at some point, a complete gospel narrative, known to early Christian communities, which presented a path to spiritual enlightenment so radical, so profoundly other, that it necessitated its utter annihilation by the powers that eventually defined Christian orthodoxy. This was no accidental loss. This was a deliberate act of historical and spiritual violence. The scattered whispers in the codex, the subtle shifts in emphasis, the echoes of familiar phrases twisted into revolutionary proclamations, all pointed to a carefully orchestrated campaign. It was an intellectual and spiritual crime, leaving behind only the faintest impressions. Like a fossilized shadow of what once stood, the realization sent a shiver down Aris's spine. The very foundation of what he, and indeed the world, understood as Christianity might have been built not just on selection, but on a profound, calculated erasure, and the true nature of the Nazarene's message, as preserved in this forbidden gospel, suggested a path to divinity not through external mediation, but through a terrifying, liberating self-discovery. The fragments Aris Thorne had painstakingly assembled painted a portrait of the Nazarene that defied centuries of conventional understanding. This was not the Christ of sermons on mountaintops, delivering ethical commandments for a future kingdom, nor primarily the sacrificial lamb whose blood redeemed humanity from sin. Instead, the erased gospel presented a figure whose core message centered on an astonishing and deeply unsettling concept, the inherent divinity within every human being, and a radical path to self-transformation that bypassed external authority entirely. In the orthodox narrative, humanity has fallen, tainted by original sin, and desperately in need of divine intervention for salvation. The Nazarene, in this framework, is the divine Son of God who descends to bridge the chasm between a righteous God and sinful humanity. His teachings guide individuals toward repentance, faith, and obedience to a benevolent, but distinct, Heavenly Father. Salvation is largely a gift, mediated through grace, sacraments, and the Church. But the fragments Aris found whispered a different truth. They suggested that the Nazarene's primary mission was not to atone for humanity's sin, but to awaken humanity to its forgotten nature. The kingdom is within you, one fragment seemed to proclaim, a phrase known from canonical texts, but here imbued with a far more literal and profound meaning. It wasn't merely a spiritual state or a future paradise. It was the recognition of an intrinsic, uncreated spark of the divine, residing deep within the human spirit. This gospel hinted at parables and dialogues where the Nazarene continually urged his disciples to know yourselves, to become as I am, to realize their true identity as children of the light. The emphasis was not on belief in Christ, but on becoming like Christ, a process of internal alchemy where the human consciousness could ascend to the divine through self-knowledge and direct experience. This path, unlike the orthodox emphasis on humble faith and obedience, demanded a terrifying self-sovereignty, an audacious claim to spiritual autonomy, and consider the ethical implications of such a teaching. If divinity resided within, then external laws and prohibitions became secondary to an inner moral compass. If salvation was a matter of awakening the divine spark, then priestly mediation, elaborate rituals, and the very concept of a hierarchical church became not just redundant, but potentially obstructive. The erased gospel suggested that the truest temple was the human heart, and the most sacred scripture was the direct experience of the divine within. This was not merely anti-establishment, it was an anti-structure theology, an inversion of power dynamics that would inevitably clash with any burgeoning institution. The figure of the Nazarene in these fragments was less of a distant, awe-inspiring deity and more of an initiator, a guide who illuminated the path to self-divinity. His miracles, if mentioned, were perhaps understood not as supernatural interventions, but as demonstrations of the inherent power accessible to those who fully realized their divine potential. His suffering, if it occurred, was not a cosmic sacrifice for sin, but a profound example of confronting the illusions of the material world and transcending its limitations. This radical ethic of self-divinity presented an irreconcilable challenge to the Roman Church, which was in its nascent stages of consolidation. The Church sought to be the sole interpreter of sacred texts, the exclusive dispenser of grace, and the ultimate authority on spiritual truth, a gospel that empowered every individual to find God within, bypassing the entire ecclesiastical apparatus, was an existential threat. It undermined the need for clergy, confession, sacraments, and the centralized control that Rome was so assiduously building. The texts, though fragmented, suggested a community that valued personal experience and direct insight over dogmatic adherence. They hinted at a form of spiritual practice that might have involved esoteric meditations, symbolic interpretations of reality, and deep introspection designed to peel back the layers of worldly illusion. The sin in this worldview was not moral transgression as much as it was spiritual forgetfulness, the failure to remember one's divine origin and purpose. For the Roman Church, this was more than a heresy, it was a contagion, a corrosive poison to their carefully constructed foundation. To allow such a teaching to flourish would be to invite spiritual anarchy, to surrender control over the hearts and minds of its adherents. The very notion that humanity could become God without the Church's explicit mediation was seen as the ultimate blasphemy, a dangerous echo of the serpent's temptation in Eden. The Church had to define itself as the sole conduit to the divine, and this gospel offered an alarming alternative. Thus, its elimination became not merely a theological preference, but a strategic imperative. The stage was set for a titanic struggle for the soul of an empire, where the price of uniformity would be the silence of forgotten truths. The early Christian landscape was a vibrant, often chaotic, tapestry of diverse beliefs, practices, and interpretations of the Nazarene's message. From the charismatic house churches to the ascetic communities in the desert, and from the sophisticated intellectual schools of Alexandria to the fervent messianic groups in Palestine, there was no single, unified Christianity. In the first few centuries, this spiritual ferment, while rich and dynamic, posed a fundamental problem for any emerging institution seeking widespread influence and control. It was into this pluralistic world that the Roman Church began its inexorable ascent, driven by a profound, strategic vision of order and a singular truth. The roots of Rome's ascendancy lay not only in theological claims, but in practical necessity and political acumen. The nascent Christian movement existed within the sprawling, highly organized Roman Empire. For Christianity to survive and thrive beyond scattered, often persecuted, communities, it needed structure, hierarchy, and a unified voice, the city of Rome. As the heart of the empire naturally became a focal point, its bishops, claiming apostolic succession from Peter and Paul, gradually began to assert a primacy over other Christian centers like Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. This assertion was not immediately accepted by all, but it was relentlessly pursued. The pressures for consolidation were manifold. Internally, doctrinal disputes like the nature of Christ, the role of law, and the path to salvation threatened to splinter the movement into countless irreconcilable factions. The existence of various gospels, each offering a different nuance or even a contradictory narrative of the Nazarene's life and teachings, fueled these divisions. If every community possessed its own sacred texts and interpreted them according to local custom or individual revelation, how could a universal church be built? Externally, the Roman Empire, though often persecuting Christians, eventually offered a path to legitimation, but for Christianity to gain imperial favor, it needed to present a cohesive, intelligible, and controllable identity. An empire built on order and law could not tolerate a religion characterized by anarchic spiritual diversity. The eventual conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century dramatically accelerated this process. Constantine, a pragmatic ruler, understood the immense unifying potential of a single, universal religion for his vast and often fractious empire. He saw in a unified church a powerful ideological tool for maintaining social cohesion and imperial authority. This alliance between church and empire fundamentally altered the nature of Christianity. From a persecuted minority, it began to transition into a state-sanctioned religion. With this newfound power came the imperative for uniformity. Divergence was no longer a mere theological disagreement. It became a threat to state stability, a form of civil disobedience that could be met with imperial force. The primary mechanism for establishing this uniformity was the ecumenical council, these gatherings of bishops, convened often by the emperor himself, aimed to define doctrine, condemn heresies, and establish a universal creed. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, though primarily focused on the Arian controversy, was a monumental step in this direction. It established a precedent for centralized doctrinal authority and created the Nicene Creed, a concise statement of belief that every Christian was expected to affirm this creed by defining the nature of God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. Implicitly rejected any competing theological systems, including those that emphasized an inherent human divinity or different path to salvation. Parallel to the councils was the crucial process of canon formation, which texts were truly authoritative, which spoke with the voice of divine truth. The selection of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and a specific collection of epistles and apocalyptic literature, was not a spontaneous, organic process. It was a deliberate, often contested, decision-making process influenced by theological criteria, but also by the needs of the emerging institutional church. Texts that supported the Roman vision of a hierarchical, sacramental, and authority-driven faith were embraced. Texts that promoted individual spiritual autonomy, challenged priestly mediation, or hinted at a different understanding of Christ's mission were increasingly marginalized, then condemned, and finally purged. This meant the systematic suppression of any gospel that dared to tell a different story of the Nazarene, especially one that undermined the Church's authority. A gospel emphasizing self-divinity, for instance, would stand in stark opposition to the Church's developing role as the sole mediator between God and man. Such a text would render the very hierarchy of bishops, priests, and sacraments largely superfluous, if not misleading. The consolidation of power was not a benevolent unification, it was a forceful assertion of a singular narrative, a calculated act of spiritual warfare against dissenting voices. The Roman Church, with the backing of the empire, began to wield not just theological arguments, but political and military might. The stakes were immensely high. Control over the interpretation of divine truth meant control over the hearts and minds of millions, shaping not only their spiritual lives, but their social and political allegiances. The diverse tapestry of early Christian belief was being systematically unraveled, thread by thread, to weave a single, impenetrable fabric, and lurking within the shadows of this newly woven orthodoxy were the unsettling echoes of a gospel that refused to conform, a gospel that now had to be utterly silenced. With Rome's shadow lengthening over the disparate landscape of early Christian belief, the presence of any alternative gospel, particularly one advocating a radical self-divinity, became not merely a theological disagreement, but an existential threat. The institutional church, rapidly cementing its power and defining its singular narrative, understood that dissent, especially from texts claiming divine inspiration, had to be not just countered, but annihilated. This chapter of erasure was executed with ruthless efficiency, marking its victims with the indelible brand of the heretic and systematically excising their voices from history. The process of vilification began with rhetoric. Church fathers, in their voluminous anti-heretical treatises, painted vivid, often grotesque, caricatures of those who held dissenting views. They were depicted as morally depraved, intellectually perverse, and spiritually deluded. Their doctrines were branded as dangerous falsehoods, concocted by the devil to lead souls astray. This rhetorical war created a climate of fear and suspicion, isolating those who dared to question the emerging orthodoxy. The erased gospel was never directly named in these condemnations, or if it was given a pejorative title reducing it to a twisted parody of truth. This allowed the Church to condemn the idea without risking the text itself gaining notoriety. Consider the accusation of spiritual elitism. If salvation lay in gnosis, inner knowledge, or self-divinity, rather than accessible faith and sacraments, then critics argued it created an exclusive spiritual aristocracy, leaving the uninitiated masses outside the reach of grace. This was a potent weapon against a gospel that emphasized individual spiritual attainment. The Church, by contrast, presented itself as universal, offering salvation to all who believed, regardless of their intellectual prowess or esoteric understanding. This positioned the orthodox path as democratic and inclusive, while the heretical one was depicted as arrogant and divisive. Beyond rhetorical denunciation, the Church employed increasingly forceful methods. The concept of heresy itself became a legal and theological weapon. To be declared a heretic was not just to hold a different belief, it was to be an enemy of God and, increasingly, an enemy of the state. This blurring of spiritual and temporal authority, catalyzed by Constantine's embrace of Christianity, gave the Church unprecedented power to persecute dissent. Imperial edicts, often issued at the behest of prominent bishops, ordered the confiscation and destruction of heretical books. Imagine the scenes: zealous scribes and clerics, armed with lists, descending upon communities suspected of harbouring forbidden texts. Libraries were purged, homes searched, any manuscript deemed unorthodox, especially one that dared to offer an alternative gospel narrative, was condemned to the flames. The goal was not merely to prevent its circulation, but to erase its very existence from memory, to deny that it ever held any legitimate claim to truth. This was not merely censorship, it was an attempted ontological deletion. The human cost of this ideological warfare was immense. Adherents of the erased gospel and other condemned sects faced severe consequences. They could be excommunicated, losing their place in the burgeoning Christian community and, increasingly, their standing in society. Their property could be seized. Their leaders were often arrested, tried, and sometimes executed, branded as sorcerers or blasphemers. The fear of persecution forced many to either recant their beliefs, feign adherence to orthodoxy, or retreat into secrecy, going underground to preserve their traditions. The silence that followed this campaign was deafening. For centuries, the orthodox narrative stood virtually unchallenged. The four canonical Gospels became the Gospels, their history presented as seamless and divinely ordained. The very idea that another, equally ancient, equally compelling Gospel might have existed, only to be systematically expunged, became unthinkable, a historical impossibility. The success of this erasure was so profound that when fragments of texts like the Nag Hammadi library or other apocryphal Gospels began to surface in modern times, their authenticity was immediately met with fierce resistance, not just from theologians, but from historians conditioned by centuries of the orthodox narrative. The strategic genius of Rome's suppression lay not just in destroying texts, but in destroying memory. By obliterating the evidence, they could then rewrite the historical narrative, presenting a monolithic, divinely sanctioned Christianity that had always been unified, the diverse, often contentious. Origins of the faith were smoothed over, replaced by a sanitized story of apostolic succession and unwavering doctrinal truth. The heretic was not just silenced, their very existence was delegitimized, their ideas dismissed as aberrations rather than legitimate. Competing interpretations, yet, as Thorne's discovery hinted, complete erasure is a mythical aspiration. Even the most thorough purges leave behind faint impressions. Like residual energy in a haunted place, the very effort involved in the suppression, the intensity of the condemnations, the ferocity of the book burnings, the scale of the persecution suggests that this erased gospel was no minor threat. It must have possessed a profound power, a seductive resonance that genuinely challenged the Church's nascent authority and its vision for humanity. And for something so fiercely suppressed, its shadow must inevitably linger, weaving its way into the forgotten pathways of spiritual descent and philosophical inquiry, waiting for the opportune moment to surface again. The triumph of the Roman Church's orthodoxy was a monumental achievement in institutional power and narrative control. The flames had consumed texts, edicts had stifled open practice, and the brand of heretic had scattered communities. Yet, the human spirit, when confronted with what it perceives as essential truth, possesses a remarkable tenacity. The radical message of the erased gospel of inherent self-divinity, of direct spiritual experience, of an inner kingdom was not so easily extinguished. It simply retreated, not into oblivion, but into the clandestine spaces, the shadowed networks, and the subtle, symbolic languages of the underground. Imagine the whispered conversations in the dead of night, the furtive exchanges of coded messages, the careful redrawing of symbols on cave walls or hidden crypts. Those who held dear the teachings of the suppressed gospel did not vanish. They adapted. Survival demanded ingenuity, a spiritual resilience forged in the crucible of persecution. The catacombs became more than just burial sites. They became metaphors for hidden spiritual landscapes, places where forbidden truths could breathe. One primary mode of survival was through oral tradition. Before widespread literacy and printed books, knowledge was often passed down through memorization and storytelling. While texts could be burned, the words held in living memory were far harder to eradicate. Master-disciple lineages, often secret and exclusive, could have preserved core teachings, couched in allegories and coded language to avoid detection. A common parable from the canonical Gospels, when retold through the lens of the erased gospel, could reveal startling new depths, hinting at self-divinity or the illusory nature of the material world. Without explicitly challenging orthodox doctrine to an uninitiated ear, symbolism became another crucial vehicle for subterranean survival. Forbidden concepts could be embedded within seemingly innocuous imagery, a particular gesture, a specific arrangement of stars, an animal motif. These could become markers of identity and shared understanding for those in the know. While appearing innocent to outsiders, the fish symbol, for instance, became a widely accepted Christian emblem. But within some subgroups, its specific shape or context might have carried layered, esoteric meanings. The serpent, demonized by orthodoxy as the bringer of sin, might have retained its ancient association with wisdom and knowledge in secret Gnostic influenced circles, its true meaning communicated through veiled artistic representations or private interpretations. Furthermore, elements of the erased gospel might have subtly influenced apocryphal literature that managed to circulate despite official prohibitions. These texts, often condemned as fabrications, sometimes contained echoes of the suppressed truths, rephrased or softened to avoid immediate detection, yet still conveying a deeper, more individualistic spiritual path. They might have been less direct than the original, but still carried the resonant frequency of an alternative understanding. The suppression also fueled the rise of various esoteric traditions that flourished in the centuries following the Church's consolidation. Alchemy, for example, with its quest for the philosopher's stone and the transmutation of base metals into gold, can be seen as a symbolic pursuit of inner spiritual transformation, paralleling the Gnostic quest for gnosis and the refinement of the divine spark within. Though overtly focused on material processes, alchemical texts often spoke in veiled language about the spiritual journey of purification and enlightenment. Similarly, early forms of Christian mysticism often pushed the boundaries of orthodoxy, emphasizing direct experience of the divine, hinting at union with God in ways that verged on the self-divinity so condemned by the established Church. These mystics, though often respected within the Church, occasionally faced scrutiny for doctrines that seemed to elevate individual experience above dogma. The fear of detection also led to the development of hidden communities and secret societies, These were not necessarily unified movements, but isolated pockets of dissent, operating in the shadows. They might have been small, familial groups passing down traditions through generations, or loosely connected networks of individuals sharing forbidden texts or interpretations. Their very existence speaks to the profound conviction that the truths they held were worth risking everything for. The legacy of this underground survival is complex. It means that the erased gospel never truly died, it fragmented, permeated other streams of thought, and adapted its form. It became a subtle current flowing beneath the surface of official history, influencing later spiritual movements, philosophical inquiries, and even artistic expressions in ways that were rarely, if ever, acknowledged. The haunting realization for the Church today is that the very act of suppression, while seemingly successful, inadvertently preserved the essence of what it tried to destroy, allowing it to re-emerge in unexpected forms, perpetually challenging the singularity of its established narrative. And this enduring, unsettling presence, often veiled in symbolism or whispered in hushed tones, continued to provoke a deep-seated anxiety in the very institution that thought it had won. The successful suppression of the erased gospel and other early heresies did not bring an end to the Roman Church's vigilance. Quite the opposite. The very act of having to ruthlessly extinguish dissenting voices instilled a profound and enduring paranoia within its institutional memory. The fear that such radical ideas, particularly those concerning self-divinity and direct spiritual experience, which undermined the Church's mediatorial role, might resurface, continued to shape its defensive posture for centuries. This persistent anxiety manifested most chillingly and effectively in the enduring mechanisms of the Inquisition. While the Gnostic movements of the early centuries had faded from overt existence, their core philosophical challenges, dualism, the rejection of material sacraments, the emphasis on inner light, and the questioning of hierarchical authority echoed in later movements that arose across Europe, the 12th and 13th centuries. In particular, witnessed the rise of groups like the Cathars in southern France. Their beliefs bore striking resemblances to ancient Gnosticism. They held that the material world was created by an evil principle, rejected the physical incarnation of Christ, disdained the sacraments, and viewed the church hierarchy as corrupt. They too sought an inner purity and spiritual knowledge, believing in a path to salvation independent of priestly intervention. For the Roman Church, the Cathars were not merely a nuisance, they were a terrifying resurgence of the very spiritual anarchy it had fought so hard to eradicate. This time, the response was even more organized and brutal. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, was a devastating military campaign that decimated the Cathar population and laid waste to much of southern France. It was a clear, unambiguous message. Theological deviation would be met with overwhelming force. Following the Crusade, the Church established the Papal Inquisition in the early 13th century. This was not a temporary measure, but a permanent, centralized, and systematic judicial process designed to identify, interrogate, and eliminate heresy. Its very existence testified to the Church's deep-seated fear of internal dissent. The Inquisition's methods were meticulous and cruel secret denunciations, lengthy incarcerations, torture to extract confessions, and public auto da fes where condemned heretics were often burned at the stake. The long memory of the Inquisition was shaped by the earlier struggle against the erased gospel. The fear of a gospel that taught self-divinity meant that any hint of spiritual individualism, any claim to direct divine revelation outside of church-sanctioned channels, was viewed with the gravest suspicion. Mystics, even those genuinely committed to orthodoxy, sometimes found themselves under scrutiny if their experiences veered too far into personal ecstasy or seemed to diminish the role of sacraments. Philosophers who explored the nature of human potential or the complexities of reality risked accusations of pantheism or promoting a self-sufficient human reason. The Inquisition became the ultimate guardian of the singular narrative. It was designed to ensure that no competing gospel, no alternative understanding of Christ or salvation, could ever again gain a foothold. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance and brutal punishment permeated society. It created a chilling conformity, where intellectual curiosity and spiritual exploration were often stifled for fear of falling afoul of the inquisitors. Books were still burned, though now with greater formality and ritual, sending a powerful visual message of the fate awaiting forbidden knowledge. Consider the trial of Joan of Arc in the 15th century. While her case involved complex political and military factors, a significant part of her condemnation revolved around her claims of direct divine revelation voices and visions that bypassed the church hierarchy. This was a consistent pattern any spiritual authority claimed by individuals, independent of the church's mediation, was immediately suspect. This deep-seated suspicion was a direct legacy of the fight against the erased gospel's emphasis on inner gnosis. Even during the Protestant Reformation, centuries later, the Inquisition, particularly the Spanish and Roman Inquisitions, remained a formidable force. While the Protestants challenged papal authority, they largely retained the orthodox understanding of human fallenness and the need for external salvation through faith, rather than an inherent self-divinity. Yet, the Inquisition's apparatus continued to target any groups, even within Catholicism, that seemed to lean towards excessive individualism or mystical experiences that might undermine the established order. The enduring existence of this oppressive machinery reveals a haunting truth: the Church was never truly at peace with the supposed victory over its early ideological rivals. The erased gospel continued to haunt it, not as a physical text, but as a potentiality, a lingering intellectual and spiritual threat. The very existence of the Inquisition, extending its reach for centuries, suggests that the fear of its core message that humanity possesses an inherent divine spark and a path to liberation independent of external religious institutions was a persistent, deeply unsettling anxiety for the institution. The suppression was not a singular event, but an ongoing campaign against an idea deemed too dangerous to live, an idea that, despite all efforts, refused to truly die, and even today, as the foundations of faith are questioned in new ways, the echoes of that long-silenced voice persist, prompting new questions about the nature of authority, truth, and humanity's spiritual destiny. The vast machinery of the Roman Church, with its councils, inquisitions, and carefully constructed canon, succeeded in burying the erased gospel deep beneath the layers of history for centuries. Its message of inherent self-divinity and radical spiritual autonomy lay dormant, known only through the scathing condemnations of its triumphant rivals. Yet, the past is never truly dead. It breathes in the present, often in ways unseen, its suppressed narratives casting long, subtle shadows over contemporary thought and spirituality. The Church, even today, is haunted by what it so meticulously tried to forget. Consider the pervasive questions that ripple through modern Western society, often divorced from traditional religious frameworks, yet resonating with the very core of the erased gospel: the contemporary yearning for personal spiritual experience over dogmatic adherence, the widespread skepticism towards institutional authority, the burgeoning interest in mindfulness, meditation, and self-discovery as paths to inner peace. These are not direct descendants of the forgotten text, but they echo its fundamental impulse. They speak to a hunger for direct connection, for an internal validation of truth, rather than relying solely on external pronouncements from religious intermediaries. The very concept of human potential, often championed in secular self-help and philosophical movements, subtly mirrors the erased gospel's radical notion of self-divinity. While stripped of theological language, the idea that humans possess untapped powers, that they can transcend limitations through inner work, or that enlightenment is an individual journey, carries a faint but undeniable resonance with the ancient call to know yourselves and become as I am. This is the unconscious re-emergence of a suppressed truth that the divine might not be exclusively external, but intimately internal, the enduring fascination with hidden truths and forbidden knowledge, evident in popular culture, conspiracy theories, and niche intellectual pursuits, also bears the ghostly imprint of this historical erasure. There is an intuitive understanding, a collective intuition, that mainstream narratives are often incomplete, that powerful institutions control information, and that significant portions of history have been deliberately obscured. This cultural undercurrent, while diverse in its manifestations, taps into the deep well of mistrust sown by centuries of enforced orthodoxy and the systematic silencing of alternative voices. The knowledge that a gospel was actively erased breeds a lingering suspicion about what else might have been hidden. For the Church itself, the haunting manifests in several ways. The historical reality of its suppressive past is increasingly difficult to ignore in an age of unprecedented information access, as more scholars and popularizers bring these forgotten texts and narratives to light. The Church is forced to confront uncomfortable questions about its origins, its claims to singular authority, and the legitimacy of its historical development. The narrative of a seamless, divinely guided tradition is challenged by the undeniable evidence of fierce theological battles and ruthless political maneuvering. Furthermore, the erased gospel's emphasis on individual spiritual power and the immanence of the divine continues to provoke internal tensions within modern Christianity. Movements that emphasize personal relationship with God, charismatic experiences, or contemplative practices often find themselves pushing against the boundaries of traditional hierarchical structures, echoing the ancient conflict between direct experience and institutional mediation. The Church grapples with how to maintain its authority and unity in a world that increasingly values personal autonomy and direct access to spiritual truth. Questions that the erased gospel laid bare millennia ago. The lingering shadow is also evident in the inherent human yearning for a comprehensive explanation of suffering and evil, if the material world is indeed flawed by its origin. Rather than merely marred by sin, it offers a different lens through which to view human predicament, one that resonates with modern sensibilities struggling with existential questions. The original reason for the erased gospel's suppression, its unsettling philosophical implications, remains a potent, unresolved challenge for any system claiming absolute truth. The fact that Rome tried to erase this gospel, rather than merely disagreeing with it, suggests that it touched upon a nerve, a truth too dangerous for the monolithic institution to tolerate. It revealed a path to spiritual liberation that bypassed the very structures the Church was building, and in its very suppression, the Church inadvertently ensured its eternal relevance. The act of erasure created a void, a nagging absence, that continues to draw those who seek beyond the surface. The erased gospel haunts the Church today not as a spectre of ancient heresy, but as a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable questions about power, truth, and the nature of spiritual authority. It reminds us that history is a contested terrain and that the official narratives, however comforting, often conceal layers of forgotten truths. The search for what was lost continues, not just in dusty archives, but in the restless human heart, perpetually seeking the full, unvarnished story of its own divine potential. What was truly lost in the fires of suppression, and how much of what we believe today is merely the echo of a deliberately chosen silence, the whispers continue. And for those who listen, the journey has only just begun.